Welcome to this concluding civil rights lesson on the late civil rights movement. This will look at protest and change between 1968 and 1970 and some events before this as well. The aims are to know the challenges still faced by black communities, to evaluate the impact of the Kerner Report, and to reflect on civil rights progress by 1975. Here's a do now task. Why was there still frustration in black communities after the legal gains of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts in the mid-1960s? Give that some thought and pause the video while you do so. Okay, you may well have identified that the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, while important, did not have a very tangible effect on people's actual quality of life. This is demonstrated quite well by the photograph on the right. This is typical of police behaviour at this time, and in fact is actually on the milder end of the scale. Black people being forced to put their arms up against a wall whilst being physically frisked by officers was a common tactic to harass black people, and that was only the half of it. We're going to find out how important the fact of police brutality against black people was in causing rioting and disorder in the mid to late 60s. So, we're going to have a look first at the background to black rioting in the mid to late 60s. Despite the legal gains of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1965, there was little improvement in many black people's lives, as follows. Police brutality and discrimination. This is a really big one. Police harassed, unjustly arrested and even shot black people. In 2.5 years before the Watts riot, 65 black people had been shot dead by police. 27 have been shot in the back, i.e. when they weren't even facing the police, and 25 of them were unarmed. So, if you consider that, over 50 of the people who had been shot were not actually presenting any threat to the police at all. This is still an issue in America today, and people are indeed protesting it even to this day. But we're looking at the issues in the 1960s, so we'll stick to those facts for now. Discrimination from officials. Again, this has been a recurring theme. City governments did nothing to respond to complaints about living conditions and did not listen to people. Unemployment too. Black people were twice as likely to be unemployed in the 60s as white people. Housing. Mostly white landlords charged high rents for low-quality, crowded housing. And poor education. Despite desegregation, schools in majority black areas were run down and underfunded, and indeed effectively still segregated. Your tasks then. Summarise the main problems of living conditions in black communities at this time. Also, why might legal gains not have translated into helping matters in living conditions in these communities? Then choose between 1 and 3 of these reasons, and then explain why they might lead to riots. The usual point example explain structure would be a good way of doing this. Pause the video while you complete this task. Okay, hopefully we've managed to make a summary there, but remember the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts are more about legal responsibilities of states and the legal rights of black Americans, not about addressing the inequalities of their living conditions and their workplaces. So that's why these legal gains might not have actually helped improve matters, because they weren't directly designed to address them. These features might have led to riots because of the anger that they caused and the frustration that nothing was being done. Communities typically could only take so much, and rioting can happen as a result. We're going to have a look at some key examples of these riots now. The riots. Bad living conditions, hot and unsanitary summers, and often a key trigger event, usually with the police, led to riots. As an example, frustrated communities who lived in bad living conditions often didn't have things like air conditioning. In California, for example, it's exceptionally hot during the summer, and so not having air conditioning can lead to a very frustrated feeling and very unpleasant living conditions. Think as well, if bins aren't being emptied and if sewers aren't being maintained, there can be a literal stink over this as well. So it can sometimes boil over when you have a simple trigger event. It was not unusual, for example, for the police to unjustly harass and pull over motorists, for example. However, it was one such incident that sparked a wider riot in Watts in LA in 1965, as we'll see. There were 329 major riots between 1964 and 1968. These left 220 people dead, over 8,000 people injured, and over 52,000 people arrested. So, one of these was in Watts in LA in August of 1965. It's worth pointing out that this one here as well was something of a backlash against the violence seen against black people at Selma, Alabama. In Chicago in 1966 as well. In Cleveland in 1966. In Newark in 1967. And Detroit in 1967 as well. Now, I don't know what your knowledge of American geography is like, but I'm going to run through the states that these places are in. So Los Angeles is in California, Chicago is in Illinois, Cleveland is in Ohio, Newark is in New Jersey, and Detroit is in Michigan. Those are all northern states, and that sets these riots rather apart from other topics that we've been looking at. I hope that you can identify why. Your tasks then. Record the riots and the relevant statistics to go with them. Most of these cities are in the north. Why might this be surprising compared to what else we've studied? And then why might these riots have occurred in the north? Take some time to answer those questions and press play when you're ready to continue. But for now, press pause. Alright, hopefully we got the main stats and names of the riots down. So these are northern cities. They're not cities in the deep south that were used to the same segregated racism and very formalised racism that you saw in the deep south in places like Mississippi and Alabama. That said, it does show that racial inequality was a problem throughout the country, and much of the progress in civil rights have been looking to address the legal inequalities that existed in the Deep South and did nothing to address the practical inequalities that existed in other cities, including in the North. In fact, these areas have been rather more neglected, and so the predominantly black areas had allowed to become run down as separate ghettos from the rest of the city. So why might these riots have occurred in the North? Well, quite simply, the living conditions there were appalling very often, and not only that, there didn't appear to be any support for them or anything being done about it. This led to frustration. Combine this with the other causes we looked at previously, and you've got a perfect recipe for civil disorder. So, Johnson's government decided to do something about it. Having had all these riots, Johnson decided to commission a report. This was commissioned in 1967 and was called the Kerner Commission, producing the Kerner Report. So, the main findings of this Kerner Report, which were released in 1968, were: riots were caused by ghetto conditions produced by segregation and discrimination. White officials failed to listen to black communities or fix their problems. Police needed to protect those in ghettos instead of victimising them. Police tactics made riots worse, and federal money was being spent on the police, not fixing the ghettos. And the media made things worse by exaggerating and sensationalising reports. Now let's be honest, some of these are absolutely blindingly obvious findings. But it is really important that they were made formal and included in a government report. This is the opposite of whitewashing or covering up the obvious problems. Instead, it is confronting them and accepting them, and that surely has got to be a step in the right direction. Consider these tasks. Record the findings on the left in order of importance. Based upon this, who was most to blame for the riots? The officials, the police, or the federal government? I've chosen not to include the rioters themselves in this because we're trying to understand the causes of the riots rather than the rioters themselves in terms of kind of criminal behaviour. Thirdly, as a challenge, the report doesn't actually fix anything of itself, but why might it still be important? Press pause while you complete those tasks. Okay, the first two tasks are very much based upon your own opinions. I'm trusting you to have explained them properly. However, the third one might be a little bit more complicated. What really is the importance of the fact that the Kerner Report actually accepted these really quite obvious problems? Well, previously governments had chosen to ignore them, and by ignoring them they were able to get away with not doing anything about them. By accepting and admitting to the fact that segregation and discrimination still existed and that this caused riots, it gave impetus to try and improve matters. And that's really important. Governments who don't take responsibility for problems seldom want to do anything about them. The issue of living conditions, though, also had an impact on Dr. Martin Luther King. We're now going to consider his last campaigns, particularly to begin with, his campaign in the North. After Selma, King began to concentrate on wider issues of living conditions and inequality elsewhere in the USA. So his campaign in the North was an attempt to address this inequality, but it largely failed for the following reasons. SCLC's non-violent and Christian protests failed to connect with ghetto communities who saw these Christian-based protests as being rather removed from their own culture. Black Chicago politicians didn't back the campaign either. They didn't see the need to necessarily, but more to the point, they didn't agree with King's tactics. King was unable to prevent violent incidents in the campaign. These were not orchestrated by him, and indeed he did try to prevent them, but unfortunately they still tarnished his reputation. Lastly, King's relationship with Johnson by this point was really breaking down. This is because of King's opposition to the war in Vietnam. Your tasks then. Firstly, what made King's campaign in the North different to his earlier campaigns? Secondly, use point, example, explain, and using the examples on the left to explain why the campaign failed. And lastly, and this is a particular challenge for those people who've looked at the Vietnam topic already, why might King have been so opposed to the Vietnam War? Answer the questions now and pause the video while you do so. Alright, King's campaign in the North is different to his earlier campaigns because it is focusing more on poverty rather than the issue of race and racism. Therefore, although impoverished areas were often predominantly black, it wasn't necessarily geared towards that. Nor was it geared towards the ending of formalised segregation like it had been in the Deep South. You can probably explain why his campaign failed because there are several reasons there. But why was King so opposed to the Vietnam War? Well, part of this might be down to his Christian beliefs and his pacifist outlook, but part of it as well was related to the Civil Rights campaign. Coming from poorer communities, black soldiers were disproportionately being drafted by the US Army, and so young black men were often going into the army where richer white men were able to avoid it. This King saw as very unfair, and I'm sure we can agree with that. This brings us on to the sad death of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. On April 4th, 1968, King was in Memphis, Tennessee. He was preparing to support striking rubbish collectors in another poor people's campaign. He had given his final speech, which is known as the From the Mountaintop speech, and he was preparing to go to bed. Whilst relaxing on a balcony at just after 6 p.m, he was assassinated by a racist sniper. So, we need to consider the main outcomes of King's death. You are now going to explain how these show that King's importance to the civil rights movement. There were deadly riots in 172 towns after King's assassination. The Poor People's Campaign failed, although it is true to say that King had been warned that it probably would. Civil rights group membership declined quite dramatically, especially among white supporters. Fewer white people were sympathetic to the civil rights cause. After the 64 and 65 Acts, they decided that the battle was mostly won. They felt that there was a lot of agitation by black protesters, and let's be honest, many white people remained racist, and the only person that they really could feel that they could deal with was Martin Luther King. Also, more black people became militant. SNCC, for example, stopped being the Student Non-Violent Coordinating Committee and became the Student National Coordinating Committee. They also lost most of their original membership at this time. The organisation that had started, being the leader of the sit-in organisation, had completely changed beyond all recognition. So, your task then is to explain how those bullet points show King's importance to the civil rights movement. You can pause the video now, and once you're done, press play to continue. We're now going to consider the role of Richard Nixon as the new president, and ask the question, did he really bring in any new change? Nixon became president in 1969, about a year after Martin Luther King was assassinated. Nixon is best known for his policies on Vietnam, on which basis he was elected, and for the Watergate scandal, which proved to be his downfall. But this is what he did in regards to civil rights. He gave funding for black people setting up their own businesses. He gave tax breaks to white-owned businesses setting up branches in black communities. These are both quite common economic features of conservative politics. He also pressed for deliberate hiring of black people to encourage equality. This is known as affirmative action and is occasionally quite controversial because it can involve giving a less qualified person a job based on their race and based upon trying to encourage equality rather than necessarily hiring the best person on paper. Also, he gave jobs to black officials. James Farmer, for example, had formerly been a corps leader, and now he was a high-level official in the Health, Welfare and Education Department of the US government. So here's your questions based upon Nixon. Summarise Nixon's actions on civil rights. You can do this in a paragraph or two. And then, do you think Nixon's actions are more changes from what came before, or more of a continuity of Johnson's approach on civil rights? Pause the video now while you complete these almost final tasks. So then, hopefully you've summarised those changes. And there are some changes to Johnson's approach. For example, the more practical business and economic approaches are rather different to what Johnson tried to do, while he was concentrating on things like the social causes behind things like the riots. Nixon was trying to encourage more prosperity economically rather than just trying to confront what social problems there were. However, there is an important aspect of continuity here. The appointing of black officials is something that really started with President Kennedy all the way back in 1961. Here, Nixon is very much continuing that trend, although if anything he is being a little bit more affirmative in the hiring of these people, potentially over similarly qualified white people, although this can be seen as a really positive step in terms of encouraging diversity within the government. So we're going to move on to our very final thoughts now, and they are going to be just that. Is this struggle over? It is true that the rights of black Americans are far better than they were in the 1950s, particularly in terms of legal gains. However, there remain big inequalities in terms of wealth, health, work, and especially and most recently, relations with the police. So I ask you to consider this. Is the civil rights struggle over, or is it simply in a new phase? One only needs to look at the news at any time and you'll see any variety of different things that relate to the struggle for civil rights. You might have seen American athletes protesting by kneeling during the national anthem, something that particularly angered President Donald Trump, who many people see as not being a great friend of the civil rights movement. You might have seen the rioting in Charlottesville, where neo-Nazis and other racists were reasserting their racist voices. More recently, and indeed tragically, it has been noted that African American communities are some of the worst affected by the coronavirus outbreak of 2020. Why is this? Is it because these black people are particularly vulnerable because of their socioeconomic background and still having to go out to work? Or is it that their health is particularly vulnerable because of the number of health conditions that exist in impoverished communities? Only time will tell in that respect. So I'm not going to give you my opinion on whether the civil rights struggle is over, although you might be able to tell, but I'm going to ask you to give it some thought, because many of these issues have not gone away. So how do we confront them for the future? On that note, this course is over. Thanks for taking part in it, and I'll say thank you for watching this video in particular. If you found them interesting and useful, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to this channel where there's plenty more content on the go. Thank you so much and goodbye.